Hi there, welcome to another Pyro seminar. Today, what I want to look at is a little bit of political theory. I want to explore how we think about and theorize about political transformation and change, and how we kind of enter into the theory and the practice of politics. And obviously, I'm wanting to look at that because we're kind of undergoing a little bit of what you could call a political awakening. There's been years of agitation in various forms, from financial instability, lack of social mobility. You've got issues in terms of alienation in the workplace, where people hate what they do. The vast majority of people hate what they do. If you do a thought experiment and you ask people, what would you do if you won the lottery? Most people, as in, what would you go back to work? And most people would say no, right? They would go back to work the next day just to tell their boss that they're finishing, or saying something worse to their boss, right? And that, of course, tells you that the vast majority of people are just doing what they're doing for the compensation of a wage. They're not doing something that is creatively engaging them, that is spiritually enriching them. They're doing it because they have to. So obviously, the vast majority of people are in that kind of situation. And so these generalized anxieties and issues have potentially been exacerbated by this global pandemic. And then they've been focused on the killing of George Floyd, and then mobilized by political movements like BLM and Antifa. So we live in this kind of cascade effect that has caused kind of eruptions of protests around the world, and millions of people are thinking about political issues, many of them doing it for the first time. And if you're kind of caught up in social media, you'll know that 100 different people will tell you 100 different ways to think, and it's very hard to kind of navigate what's going on and kind of get a little bit of distance to understand it while being kind of caught up in it. So what I want to do is I want to take a kind of a larger view of things for a bit, and then at the end of this paper kind of maybe focus in a little bit about what political action looks like. And in order to do that, political theory is a very complex area, and beginning to get a grip of how to think politically, especially if it's someone's first time, it can be very daunting. So what I want to do is simplify things. Now, this is not going to be an easy talk necessarily, but it does have a simple premise. Because political theory is a little bit like chess, right? Chess is an incredibly complex game, and it still hasn't been solved. So the largest computers in the world still have not cracked the game of chess, right? They can beat any human player, but the game itself has not been solved. And yet, the rules of chess are simple, right? So you can learn the rules of chess in an hour, less than an hour, and then you build on that. And so in a similar way, I want to talk about approaching political change, looking at it through the lens that there are really two ways of doing it, right? All kind of types of political theories of change, I want to say, kind of can be put into one of two buckets. The first bucket is concerned with a generalized alienation that pervades the social fabric. And the second type concentrates on explosions of oppression and violence that happen within the social fabric. So one is a generalized anxiety that permeates society, and the other focuses on concrete expressions of oppression and violence that erupt within society. So I'm going to look at those two positions, and I'm going to argue that they need to be thought in the right relation. And when we get them in the right relationship with each other, we can understand what dynamic and powerful social change can look like. And if we get them in the wrong relationship, we end up with political acting out, and we end up with political acts that actually are a social utility for the system. They may look as if they're attacking the system, but they actually bolster it, right? They change it in a subtle way, but not in a deep way, kind of like rearranging chairs on the Titanic. All right. So I want to call the first approach to politics the dialectic approach, and the second the symptomatic approach. So the dialectic approach is going to be an approach that looks at this generalized anxiety and this generalized alienation or estrangement that permeates the entire social fabric. And the symptomatic as a type of political approach that looks at the explosions of violence that are occurring within a given system. And there's going to be three parts or three arguments that I'm going to make. The first is that the dialectic approach is the basis for any truly emancipatory project, right? The dialectic approach is the basis for any truly emancipatory project. Secondly, the symptomatic approach, without being rooted in the dialectic approach, will end up serving the system that it appears to be undermining. So the symptomatic approach, if it is detached from the dialectic approach, will end up being a social utility for the very system that it attacks. And the third argument is that the dialectic approach cannot be detached from the concerns expressed by the symptomatic approach without becoming impotent and falling foul of some utterly contentless utopian form. So the dialectic approach cannot be detached from the symptomatic approach without basically losing its emancipatory potential. In other words, they both have to be interwoven with each other, but the dialectic approach has to be the basis out of which the symptomatic approach can be understood, and where the symptomatic approach becomes itself an emancipatory project. Okay, so those are the three arguments I'm going to try to make. In order to do that, we have to start with a definition of the dialectic approach. And to understand the dialectic approach, basically we have to start by understanding the philosophy of Hegel, at least in its broad trajectory. So Hegel's philosophy is a subtle and sustained reflection on how contradiction lies at the heart of thought and being. Right? So Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, his most famous book, basically explores how consciousness develops through contradiction. And he looks at this through what he calls the very beginning, sense certainty, through perception, understanding, self-consciousness, reason, and spirit. So there are these, what he calls, forms of life that arise. And you can almost imagine this like a child. Like an infant is caught in what's called sense certainty, right? A sense certainty is where you're not really, the only thing you're certain of is the sensations that you're receiving, right? You're certain of them because you feel them. You don't know if there's an external world or not. You're not even asking that question. You just experience things. And you have this, you could call it seemingly immediate experience of the world. And then Hegel says, but this is ultimately not the case. And he uncovers a certain contradiction within sense certainty that then moves to perception. And perception is where then the child begins to pick out objects. So at first you're just experiencing a whole range of sensations, and then you move into actually grasping a particular object and seeing objects in the world. And then eventually that, you kind of like falls into a type of contradiction, and you start to see the forces and the laws that are behind reality. You don't see the, gravity, for example, but you experience it. It's not, in one way, it's not in objects, but it is. It permeates objects, but not as something you can see. So what you're seeing here is just Hegel is showing how consciousness develops, becomes more complex through a series of deadlocks or contradictions. Contradiction, then, for Hegel is not something that is external to reality, but is rather part of reality. right? So it's not that there are two things that are in contradiction with each other. There is one thing that is in contradiction with itself. And it's this that's the kind of combustion engine that moves things forward. This contradiction also takes different forms throughout history. So at different points, the contradiction looks different or can be expressed in different ways. It's kind of the same contradiction, but it always takes different historical forms. It erupts in different ways. History itself is made up of different stages or forms of life that arise out of the attempt to overcome the contradiction of the previous stage. So that's again what Phenomenology of Spirit is about. The reason why I'm starting there is because Marx takes Hegel's basic dialectic process and applies it to society, applies it to kind of materialist concerns. So Marx takes this dialectic process that Hegel is mostly concerned with in relation to consciousness, how thought arises, how reason arises, and ultimately how spirit arises. And Marx takes that and he uses it to see how societies change in relation to how they create and distribute commodities. So a commodity is just an object that is a mix of nature and labor, right? So anything you see around you right now in your room or wherever you're watching this is a commodity. So a car, for example, is a mix of natural materials but with labor involved to bring it into the shape that it's in. And society goes through different stages. So what Hegel calls modes of life, sense certainty, perception, understanding, Marx calls, or he applies this to what he calls modes of production, right? Different ways in which we produce. And Marx basically outlines 7 modes of production. The first is, you've got a tribal mode of production. He talks about an Asiatic mode of production. He talks about a feudal mode of production. He talks about slave mode of production, feudal mode of production, capitalist mode of production, which we're currently in, and then postulates a socialist mode of production and then a communist mode of production. So there's 7 modes of production. And what generates the movement through these is contradiction. That a problem arises, for example, within a kind of a master-slave mode of production, and a contradiction arises, and the reconciliation or the overcoming of that contradiction leads to feudalism. And then a contradiction arises in feudalism, and the solution to that enters into capitalism. There's a slight difference between Marx and Hegel in this. Because Hegel ultimately ends with what he calls absolute knowing, where one basically embraces the contradiction, one is able to live within it, one is able to not try to overcome it, but rather integrate it into society. Whereas Marx seems to postulate the end of history in communism, which is not where you integrate contradiction into itself, but where you get to a utopia without contradiction. And this is what Todd McGowan calls the right-wing deviation of the left. I'm not going to go into that in any detail, just wanted to mention it as an aside. But basically the same kind of structure applies. Marx takes Hegel's kind of notion. Now, in my last seminar, I talked a little bit about these contradictions, but I'll just go over it very briefly. You could say that the central contradiction within a kind of slave society is that the slaves are producing everything, and obviously the lords, the masters, are consuming it, and they control the slaves through fear. Now, for Hegel actually as well, the emancipatory potential is fundamentally on the side of the slave. They are the one who is working on the earth. They are creating things, and by creating things, they are expressing their creative nature. The slave is kind of coming to know themselves through what they create. But what they create is then used by the master. But in a very superficial sense, you can say that eventually the slaves, there's more of them. They're being deeply oppressed. They've got the skills, they've got the strength, they're creating. Eventually they rise up and they kind of destabilize that entire mode of production. And so you can move into feudalism. And you could say that feudalism then, the oppression is slightly more hidden. Because in feudalism, it's not simply that you serve the lords and the ladies because you're forced to. You are forced to, and if you don't, there will be repercussions. But the system is also solidified through ideology, through religion, through education, telling you that you're in your place because the universe or God wants it. They are in their place because they've been chosen by God. Kind of a great chain of being. We're all part of the same organism. It's one body. You're the hands, you're not the brain, and it all should function correctly. So in feudalism, certain people produce goods, and they give maybe 20% of those goods, whatever, to the aristocracy, the lords and the ladies, and then they take the rest into the marketplace and they sell them, and they exchange goods, and they get the value of their goods in the market, right? You create something, you create shoes, and your creative spirit is in those shoes, and you go into the marketplace and you trade them and you get their value through other things. But you are oppressed in the sense of you have to give 20% away to someone else, right? But then in capitalism, the oppression becomes even more invisible, because in capitalism, everybody is free under the market. Everyone's equal under the law, right? In reality, maybe not, but Marx is always taking things in their ideal. And if you look at my last seminar, you'll know why that's the case. Marx is never critiquing capitalism because it fails to live up to its ideals. He's critiquing it if it did live up to its ideals. That in a well-run capitalist system, everyone's under the law. There is a meritocracy. Everybody goes into the marketplace, and no one is coerced into selling or buying anything, right? But then Marx says, but within the capitalist mode of production, the oppression comes in a very invisible way. You don't see it immediately. And it's because within capitalism, there is one thing that never gets its value, right? Everything else gets its value. You go into a marketplace, you negotiate what you're selling or what you're buying, right? And people can freely choose to buy this product or not. So just like in feudalism, but even more so, everything gets its value in the marketplace in an ideal way, right? There's obviously people who steal and lie, but in the ideal, you go into the marketplace, you sell commodities, products, and you get their value, with one exception. And the one exception is labor power. You sell your labor power in the market, right? You go up to somebody and you basically say, I will, for $50 a day, work for you. And then you create a product for them, right? You don't even create the whole product, you create one tiny bit of the product, so you're kind of alienated from the creative process. You're putting the heads on pins, right, or whatever, right? I give you my labor power for $50. And the only reason you accept that is because I can make you $100 a day, right? And out of that extra $50, maybe you put $25 back into the company, and you take that other $25 and that goes to the shareholders, right? So that's surplus value. And so if the system is working perfectly, I never get, right, regardless of how I feel, right, I never get the full value of my labor. By definition, it always has to be undersold, right? And so no matter how much you're paid, you can be paid very, very well, but you're still producing this surplus value for somebody else, right? So Marx says that this, while it can function fine for years, just like a house that's badly built can stand for years, eventually gravity pulls it all down. Gravity's always been at work, but gravity eventually pulls the whole house down. And eventually there will be booms and busts. There will be, things like runaway inflation, these various issues that we see in capitalism. Like they're basically generated from this pervasive antagonism that is there and that permeates everything in the social fabric. And then Marx is saying that once we make that clear and we address that, that can then move us into a different mode of production. Okay, so that's kind of basic Marxism. So an antagonism is necessarily generated within the mode of production, just as for Hegel, a contradiction is necessarily generated within a form of life, right? So modes of productions have a central antagonism. Now then, contingent antagonisms then can be addressed without any qualitative change in the current system. But the necessary antagonism cannot be dealt with without the system fundamentally changing into something else. Okay, so this is key. There are all sorts of contingent things that happen in a society, violence that erupt, right? Selfishness and sadisms we're going to come to in a second, but that erupt within society. And technically, we can change those, we can address those without getting to the central antagonism, right? But we can't address them all because the central antagonism will always generate symptoms. It has to have explosions of violence. It has to have scapegoats. It has to have people who are, in a way, the material embodiment of the inherent generalized antagonism. So in scapegoating, basically one thing, the goat initially, right, becomes the concrete manifestation of the generalized anxiety, sense of alienation, or what's called sin of the people. It's put into the goat, so it's concretized, but the goat really just expresses a generalized set of issues and antagonisms within the community. But as long as you have the scapegoat and you send the scapegoat into the desert or you kill the scapegoat, then that then allows the system to continue to go on for a while. It kind of like in the work of René Girard, who's very good on this, it kind of lowers the anxiety in the community. It lowers the mimetic violence of the community, and things can keep going. But then eventually things start to erupt, things start to get more tense. You need to then get another scapegoat and keep the ritual going, right? Christianity, for René Girard, is the act of breaking the entire scapegoat mechanism, right? It's the sacrifice of sacrifice itself, right? So in Christianity, it's not a sacrifice, it's a sacrifice of the sacrificial system. All right, so while the former, right, addressing contingent antagonisms can cause a transformation within the system, the latter causes a transformation to the system itself. To use a biological term, the system becomes a new species, right? An evolutionary thing is there's small changes within the system, but eventually an animal can become a new species. Okay, I'll take an example from relationships as well. So if you're in a relationship with somebody and you're always fighting about small things, who left the bathroom light on or not washing the dishes in the sink, right? Sometimes they can just be small arguments, right? Everyone has small arguments. But if they start taking on a really big significance, right? People really explode over these small things. Then you can say that these symptoms are kind of both point towards and simultaneously cover over something more fundamental, which we can call the symptom. So a symptom is a contingent eruption of an issue, and a symptom is the central antagonism. And if you deal with the symptoms in this relationship, right, so you're always fighting about washing up the dishes, and so you start to put the dishes in the dishwasher. If they are symptoms, there will be a new set of explosive issues will arise. Like whack-a-mole, you hit one and another one will arise, because it simultaneously speaks the truth of the symptom while also obscuring it, right? So to the untrained eye, you're like, okay, you're always arguing about this issue, right? But to the trained eye, it's going like, this issue is pointing towards something. It's speaking a truth that we need to address. So instead of just addressing, like, here's an example I know of a guy who's a therapist who said that this child came to the therapy and he came to the therapy because the parents were saying this child has some sort of anxiety issues and he keeps wetting the bed, and wanted to kind of work out what was going on. And very quickly this therapist was talking to the kid and realized that the bedwetting was a symptom that instead of directly addressing that and finding cognitive ways to kind of stop the kid wetting the bed, what he really needed to do is bring the parents into the therapeutic space, have all three of them there, and begin to talk. And as they talked, they found that the parents were in a very antagonistic type of relationship, and the child was internalizing the conflict between the parents, and the result was the bedwetting. And so instead of dealing with the bedwetting, they talked about the fundamental kind of antagonisms between the parents, and as they began to address that, the bedwetting stopped. Right? So the bedwetting was a symptom that pointed to a symptom. Now, another difference between symptom and symptom, which are psychoanalytic terms. Symptom is a word that's used by Lacan. The difference between a symptom and a symptom is a symptom can be unraveled and you can fix it, right? You can kind of like move beyond it. But what you'll end up doing is moving to a deeper symptom, right? The symptom is like the central knot that's within you. And you can't unravel that without unraveling yourself, right? It's something that's so central to you that to take it apart would be the equivalent of losing your subjectivity. But in the context of a relationship, it means that the symptom can be changed without the relationship changing. But if you get to the symptom, the relationship has to change. You can't address that symptom without either the couple breaking up or the couple breaking up with the type of relationship that they had, right? So often actually people break up so as to maintain the same type of relationship that they had, right? But then other people can break up with the type of relationship they have with the person so that they can stay with them, right? So that's kind of the more radical move. But the symptom means you cannot keep things as they are. Something needs to break. And the symptoms point towards it, but also kind of cover it over. Okay, unless the issue is directly addressed, then the relationship, if this underlying issue is directly addressed, then the relationship fundamentally changes or ends, but it cannot remain the same. The contingent issues are connected to the deeper issue and can lead us toward it, but those issues also cover over the central issue and obscure it. Right. Another example would be an alcoholic. Right. Someone is drinking too much. If we simply try to get them off the alcohol through using neuro-linguistic programming or something, that can be useful. But if you don't address what's behind it, they'll end up doing something else, right? Drinking obsessively Coke or something, right? So what you have to do is you have to see what is the alcoholism the solution to. And when you do that, you can deal with not just the alcoholism, but also what would then generate other symptoms. So for Marx, the symptomatic oppressions within a given economic mode are connected to its central contradiction. While these other social oppressions can be to a limited extent dealt with, they will erupt in other ways until the central antagonism is revealed and addressed. Without an eye for the societal symptom, one can never really get rid of symptoms. Ultimately, the contingent oppressions generated by a given mode of production can only be policed, swapped, allowed to act out, or ignored. And Marx was primarily interested in trying to reveal the central antagonism. Now then, this brings us to a critique that's often leveled today against a lot of Marxists, which is what's called class reductionism. And class reductionism is the idea that you think that all oppressions arise from this one central oppression. First of all, I'm going to address that a little bit in a second, a little bit more. But for now, what I'll say is that, well, Marx was not interested in all oppressions. That's something that some people say today. Both the detractors of Marxism and friends of Marxism will say that kind of Marxism is against oppression within social reality. But it's not. Otherwise, Marxism existed before Marx. Like social oppressions and oppressions have existed all throughout time. And all of us are overcoming oppressions in different ways, right? If you are a doctor helping someone to overcome a disease, you are overcoming an oppression. If you're helping someone learn to walk again after something happened, or by providing an artificial limb, you're overcoming an oppression. If you're helping someone learn the guitar or learn how to write, you're helping someone overcome an oppression. There are lots of oppressions, from death to just skills that we don't have. And none of that commits you to kind of a Hegelian or a Marxist kind of notion of reality. You know, Marx was interested purely in how this contradiction plays out in different moods. And his primary interest is how does it play out in the capitalist mode of production. So in a way, Marx is not interested in any other oppressions. However, and this is where they do link, for Marx, most social ills that we see today are agitated, exemplified, and maintained by the central antagonism. So while there will still be people who are sectarian or racist or sexist in any society, what you find within capitalism is these things don't just exist in like really kind of minor forms, but they can be exacerbated, they are exemplified, and they are maintained because of the central antagonism. So there is a link between them, an important link, but they're not reducible to each other. Okay. So for instance, one will not completely get rid of sectarianism if we are not able to create a system. Okay, so for instance, one will not completely get rid of sectarianism if we are able to create a system in which the surplus value of workers is no longer appropriated by others. But one will be getting rid of a structure that uses sectarianism as a social utility. Right? So sectarianism, it's not inherently connected to this idea of surplus value, but it does have a social utility to oppression, right? It's a way for, it's a way to kind of scapegoat. I remember I said scapegoating. It's a way to go, your generalized anxiety in society, your generalized feeling that things aren't right, even when everything's are going well, right, can then be put into something that you can blame. Oh, it's because of the immigrants. It's because of that group of people, or it's because of that problem. And if I got rid of that, everything would be fine. Right, so that allows you to kind of cover over the Santom, right, the central antagonism. So in classical Marxism, there is a unity between certain significant forms of social violence that erupt in a society and the central antagonism. They cannot be prized apart, but neither can the former be completely reduced to the latter. All right, so that's a dialectic approach. Now I briefly want to talk about the failure of the dialectic approach, where it began to fall apart. And in America, you could say that this maybe begins to really be seen in the kind of the early 20th century. So in the US, we can see a shift in the left away from a dialectic approach to understanding political change towards what can be called a symptomatic approach. Here we witness a very slight change in focus. The Santon of surplus value is moved towards the symptom of economic inequality. The difference is hard to spot because both positions focus on economic factors, but the scientific critique of surplus value became the moral critique of selfishness. So really what we see in the early 20th century is variety of what Richard Rorty calls reformist leftists, right? They are focused on economic injustice in America, right? So they're about unions, they're about making sure the wage or the wealth gap doesn't get bigger and even get smaller. They're interested in social mobility. They're interested in those issues, just like you would expect a Marxist to be interested in. But the critique could be called a critique of selfishness. The issue is people want more and more and more of things. So we have to create laws that prevent people from being able to accumulate vast sums of wealth at the expense of the vast majority. Very true. That's a problem, right? So that was kind of the focus of the reformist left. In Richard Rorty's famous essay called The Cultural Left, which I really recommend, he has a prediction basically of Trump in that essay, so it's fascinating. Right, he calls this group the reformist left and argues that they began to lose their foothold in the 1950s because they were largely indifferent to the social oppressions that were taking place in the US. Basically, they were almost solely concerned with changing laws that protected workers' rights. And so they tended to overlook the concrete sufferings of a gay community, the black community, and women in America, to name a few. Right? So they weren't indifferent to these issues, but they felt that they would kind of clean themselves up if the economic situation was fixed. And so, of course, that caused a lot of problems. The reformists were not indifferent to these issues, but felt that they could effectively disappear if economic equality was properly addressed. The difference between the dialectic approach and the reformist approach was minimal, but it effectively put the left into a situation in which class antagonism was no longer seen as an expression of a central contradiction within the system, by the way, which affected everybody, even the wealthy. It plays itself out in class warfare, but it affects everybody, right? And rather saw it as a contingent issue that could be fixed within the system. So, right, there's a slight move between going, right, there's a problem with the system itself to the idea that there is a problem within the system. And if we deal with selfishness and economic inequality, we can fix other social ills. So the symptom was covered over by a symptom, the central symptom, economic inequality. Something which ultimately led to a type of capitalist left that didn't seek to overcome the system, but rather to improve it. Okay, and now we enter into a definition and a look at the symptomatic approach. Okay. With this slight change, we witness a shift from the dialectic approach to the symptomatic one. Once economic issues were divorced from the idea of a necessary contradiction, as expressed in surplus value, then they became contingent issues. As a result, their primacy as the highest oppression in the great chain of oppressions could be and would be increasingly challenged. Okay, so now with the reformist left, economic injustice was the top of the chain of oppressions, right? That was the one that kind of like had to be dealt with. But it was kind of put on an equal footing as all other oppressions, just as the most serious one. In the world of the 1950s, where there was all sorts of other serious oppressions, this began to be challenged, right? People could legitimately argue that some of the other things that were happening in society were more immediate and more violent than workers' rights. Okay, there was like serious oppression, racism, sexism, sectarianism, hatred of immigrants. All of this was going on, and can legitimately say these are more prescient issues than the economic one. So we're talking about police violence, homophobia, sexism, racism, etc. The move from a dialectic left to the reformist left led naturally to what Rorty calls the cultural left. The cultural left were those activists who focused on addressing a wide range of issues relating to sadistic tendencies in society. So this is also a move mixing Freud and Marx a little bit. So the reformist left for Rorty were concerned with selfishness, and the cultural left were more concerned with sadism. Basically, the idea that we actually bully people and hate people even when it is of no economic benefit to us, right? There is a certain inherent enjoyment in oppressing people that cannot be simply reduced to the idea that we want to accumulate more wealth, right? Which is very true. As this approach was theorized, it became known as the politics of difference and gave birth to a variety of new academic fields which concentrated on various forms of oppression that could be witnessed in society. This is also the start of identity politics. The politics of difference is just another term for it, philosophy term for it. The symptomatic approach opened up the reformist left and exemplified by the cultural left focuses on the contingent explosions of violence and injustice that arise within a given mode of production. Right? And we can see this expressed in a book written by John Caputo and Giuliano Vadimo, where Caputo writes, I'm a big fan of Caputo actually, so I'm going to be critical of this paragraph, but I am a big fan of him. He says, I would be perfectly happy if the far left politicians in the United States were able to reform the system by providing universal health care, effectively redistributing wealth more equitably with a revised IRS code, effectively restricting campaign financing, enfranchising all voters, treating migrant workers humanely, and effecting a multilateral foreign policy that would integrate American power within the international community, i.e. intervene upon capitalism by means of serious and far-reaching reforms. If after doing all that, Badiou and Zizek complained that some monster called capital still stalks us, I would be inclined to greet that monster with a yawn. Okay, so what Caputo is saying here is, if we were able to enact all of these very important changes within the system, then this great monster of the system wouldn't really be much of a monster at all, right? Here we see a subtle shift from an attempt to isolate the central antagonism that the system requires to antagonisms that can be effectively removed while keeping the system largely intact. The issue is this: what if the dialectic approach is accurate, what if you cannot fix all of those problems and have the system remain? That the system requires these injustices to function. And while if you deal with one of them, or two of them, or three of them is possible, they will erupt in new ways. If that is the case, which is the kind of the dialectic claim, then you cannot domesticate the beast. Right? You cannot make this monster into a puppy dog. You can address things, but again, it's like whack-a-mole. You will just be then finding new scapegoats within this sacrificial system. It is a system that requires scapegoats. And if you fix one scapegoat group, you'll end up with another, right? Another morally justifiable group to hate, to ridicule, to laugh at, right? So if not much changes, it's just social media finds a new group to mock, right? As a simple way of saying it. The explosions of violence within capitalism are ever changing, but they cannot be eradicated. New group identities are formed, old ones dissolved, and different forms of temporarily acceptable tyranny will arise. While the symptomatic approach sees the system as flawed, the problem is viewed as a failure to live up to its ideals. Ideals such as meritocracy, unconstrained productivity, free movement within the market, and everyone being equal under the law. The argument goes, within the symptomatic approach, the argument goes that with the pacification of certain groups, not treating everyone fairly, doing violence to certain groups, only certain people get to fully participate in the market. And ultimately, everyone suffers because the skills and talents of certain groups is never given the space to thrive, right? However, the issue is that the system itself requires certain explosions of violence in order to keep the central antagonism in place. So basically, a symptomatic approach is saying that the system would run better if there was no systemic injustice, right? Everyone is able to achieve within the society, everyone's given the same opportunities, that will actually improve the system because more people will be in the workplace, more talents in the workplace, more skills in the workplace, leading to better productivity and a better running system. The various symptoms can be unraveled then while keeping the system in place. It is only in the but what if it's only in the unraveling of the Santom that the system itself can give way to something else, right? So in the words of Zizek, who's responding to Caputo, he says this: the problem here is not Caputo's conclusion. If one can achieve all of that within capitalism, well then yeah, why not remain there? The problem is the underlying utopian premise that it is possible to achieve all that within the coordinates of the present global capitalism. What if the particular malfunctioning of capitalism enumerated by Caputo are only not only accidental disturbances, but structurally necessary? What if Caputo's dream is a dream of universality, the universal capitalist order, without its symptoms, without its critical points in which its repressed truth articulates itself? In other words, Zizek is saying, if capitalism has this central antagonism that always has to speak, right, always has to find a way to erupt, then you cannot get rid of the symptoms and create a capitalist system that is smoothly running, because it is not a smoothly running system. It exists because of the antagonism. The symptomatic does offer something important as a type of antithesis to the structural approach. It leads to the potential of a greater understanding of and appreciation of the relationship between the Santom and the symptom. But it must be integrated into the dialectic approach in the appropriate way. So I guess what I'm arguing is that the symptomatic approach kind of is a development and is something that arises for an important reason. And it's incredibly important, but it has to be seen within the dialectic structure. And then very quickly, I want to say, is there a third way? Is there a way of mixing these two differently, where the dialectic isn't the base and the symptomatic then what arises out of it? And I would say no, there is no third way. The most popular attempt at a third way today is intersectionality, right? Intersectionality, which attempts to weave all of the symptoms together in different ways. But intersectionality itself has to be interpreted either in a symptomatic approach or in a dialectic approach. And it's mostly seen in a symptomatic way. It's not impossible to think of a type of intersectionality that is based on the dialectic approach, but at the moment, intersectionality is primarily based on the symptomatic as the foundation. Okay, right, we're getting there. We're nearly at the end. So I want to talk about awareness of the dialectic structure approach within the symptomatic. What I want to say here is the point is not to overturn the symptomatic approach, but rather to understand that the symptomatic approach to political action must be put into correct relation with the dialectic approach. When they are correctly oriented in relation to each other, then we can address symptoms with a view to exposing the central antagonism that is articulated and hidden in this violence. If we don't have the correct relation, then we won't be able to move towards the type of economy that can actively integrate its contradiction. The following are 3 criteria we can use to help us work out if the relation between the dialectic and the symptomatic is correct. So here's just 3 criteria to use to kind of figure out whether the relationship is correct. The first is, does our political movement have a universalist orientation that grounds particular issues? So in other words, does our political movement galvanize everyone, right? To kind of somehow is good news to everybody. So it addresses particularistic issues with a view to universal transformation. Number 2, are we focused on an essential deadlock that grounds the contingent explosions of social oppression, right? So we've kind of covered that. Is our political theory and our political action seeking to ultimately expose and address something that is central to capitalism itself? And thirdly, is contradiction able to be maintained and exposed rather than reduced to opposition? And I'm not going to say too much about this. I've talked about this elsewhere, but the idea is what we tend to do is we reduce contradiction to opposition. The generalized symptom that's of surplus value, the general problem that we face within the societal fabric is put into an opposition between us and them. They're the problem. If we got rid of them, everything would be good. And so are we avoiding oppositional thinking? Are we avoiding scapegoating, right? If we're getting caught up in scapegoating, if we are getting caught up in oppositional thinking, then we have the relationship in the wrong way. Ultimately, we want to maintain the contradiction, see it, and ultimately find a way of using it and integrating it in a positive way. By the way, there's examples of what that looks like. Democracy is the name for a productive use of antagonism and contradiction within politics. So you have all of these contradictory positions within society, and those contradictions are brought together in a democratic system, which then allows for transformation. And I'm going to talk about what that looks like in the economy in a second. Okay, those are the three things. So in conclusion then, what does this look like? I want to give two concrete kind of like things that I think come out of this kind of notion. One is we could be committed to creating communities that are disinvested from the lost object, right? That is my work. That's been my work for the last 20 years, creating communities that are disinvested from the lost object. What I mean by that is the reformist left are dealing with selfishness. The cultural left are dealing with sadism. These are both connected, I would argue, with this pursuit of wholeness and completeness, and then the need to blame someone for not getting there. And if you can have communities that are literally disinvested from this frenetic pursuit of the thing that will make you whole and complete, that will radically change people in relation to the social evils of selfishness and sadism, right? So I think that's an incredibly important work. I think that the system we currently live in basically operates and runs through our desire to continue to pursue something that will make us whole and complete, that will fix us. And the continual failure to get that causes us to hate other people and to despise and to get into all of these conflicts and scapegoating mechanisms. So communities of the contradiction, I've called them before, these communities of the contradiction that disinvest us from this libidinal pursuit of the lost object, can address the issues of selfishness and sadism within us as individuals, within community. There's enough of these within a society. And secondly, I'm very drawn by the cooperatives, that if you are wanting to do something in the world economically that avoids alienation as much as possible, I think setting up a business that is a type of cooperative is a way to go about things. There's an example in Belfast of a brewery called Boundary. I recommend you look it up. They do great beer. It's a cooperative. So it's set up by a group of people who have shares in it, who work within it, and the surplus value that is generated by Boundary Brewery is then distributed among the people who work there. And so it's kind of bringing democracy into the workplace. And, people get paid more or less. So the guy who runs it will get paid more. The more successful the business is, the more he'll get paid. He'll also get some of the surplus value that's created by the business, but also so will the other people working there. And I think it's a great way to do things, because if you set up a cooperative, even though you can get well paid, your main motivation isn't money, right? Because you'll always be kind of limited as to what you can get. So it means you're not just going to make widgets, right? I want to make widgets to make money, right? You're going to have to find something you're really passionate about. So this guy Matthew wanted to create a community, a bar, a brewery, somewhere for people in East Belfast to come, to drink, to meet, to hang out. He wanted it for himself. He wanted it for his friends. So he's passionate about his work. He's not alienated from it. If he won the lottery tomorrow, he would just pour that money into making Boundary bigger and better, right? Because he's not alienated from his work. He's enjoying his work. The people benefit, so everybody's motivated by their job. They feel part of it. They're connected by it. And it has social good within the community. So Icon is an example of the former, a collective that helps you disinvest from the lost object. And then Boundary is an example of the latter, doing something, either being part of or setting up a type of cooperative. It's not the only answer, but there's two kind of things that come out of it. And then in relation to what we're seeing today, the thing that I think is the most interesting is actually locating the contradiction within the protests. So there is a contradiction within the current protests that are happening that hasn't been talked about very much, but I think it's really interesting. And it's the contradiction and the conflict between Black Lives Matter and Antifa, right? They don't fit that neatly together. So Black Lives Matter largely began as a movement interested in representation in the workplace and meritocracy stripped of its systemic injustice. So, right, and that's why corporations can get behind it. That's why Jeff Bezos or whatever can get behind it, because it's more about representation and a meritocracy stripped of systemic injustice. Antifa is mostly anarchist. So they're trying to directly instantiate a type of communist ideal, right, by creating these TAZ, temporary autonomous zones, and kind of directly enacting the classless, stateless, moneyless society. I think that's really interesting how that's going to go. I mean, my predictions are that tension will potentially kind of increase, but that tension could create a new political consciousness that brings the best of both together. And that political consciousness would be a type of, I think, kind of socialist BLM movement that has a critical engagement with corporate America, and aims at the central antagonism within society. So that's, I even saw this starting to work itself out with the Seattle zone, because it was called CHAZ, which is an anarchist term, you know, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. Autonomous Zone comes from Hackham Bay, so it's an anarchist phrase. And it was changed to Capitol Hill Organized Protest, which is more Black Lives Matter. And so you can see there's a creative tension there. And I think there's a possibility that tension could create something good. I don't think it's going to happen, but I think it's possible. Okay, so there you go. I'm just going to see if there's any questions, and thanks for sticking with it. Right. Dave said, put a coin in the jar, Pete. What did I do? What do I have to put a coin in the jar for? Is that every time I say a certain word? Is it dialectic or something? Okay, Joseph is saying, how, according to Marx, can one get the value of production? You might need to kind of give me more, because I'm not 100% sure what you're asking. The value of production, like how can we distribute that among the people who produce it? Is that what you're saying? Or how is value, what is value, or how is value created? If you want, type it in and then I'll look at it again. Sorry, you've also only got a certain amount of space to type a question. I apologize. Let's see. Oh yes, good stuff, Peter, even if you can't say the word extemporaneously. I said it. Brilliant. Yeah. I'm going to cut that bit out of the talk, by the way, so nobody will see that. Did anyone catch the name of the essay? I think if you're talking about the Richard Rorty essay, it's called The Cultural Left. It's very interesting because Rorty's a liberal political thinker. One of the most interesting American philosophers of the late 20th century, really interesting guy, but coming from a different angle from me, and I'm kind of critical of some of his stuff, but that essay is very, very good. And that's where I take the notion of the reformist left and the cultural left, which I think is a very interesting way of looking at things. And he also has a really brilliant sense of American history that I don't have. So I'm kind of relying on his work to make the claim that in the 1950s, there was this move from the reformist left to the cultural left. That's literally through reading his work rather than having a strong sense of American history. Okay, Justin says, could you elaborate on how intersectionality is generally understood symptomatically? Yeah, the way I understand intersectionality as a symptomatic approach is because what it's doing is it's taking seriously all of the different kind of like injustices and violences that are erupting within society, and it's seeing them as interconnected, and it's trying to find a type of universality. So there is this move in intersectionality towards universality. So that's where some people could hear intersectionality as being a dialectic approach, because dialectic approach is a universalist approach that has an eye on particularity, but ultimately has universality beneath it. And so you could look at intersectionality and go, oh, it's a universalist project insofar as it's connecting different forms of social oppression together. The reason why I say it's a symptomatic approach is because it doesn't see the central symptom beneath the symptoms. For me, it's kind of basically interweaving all the symptoms together, but still not with an eye to that Hegelian Marxist kind of like aim towards the kind of surplus value issue. Hopefully that makes some sense. Sarah says, Sarah Marshall's podcast, you're wrong about that. I don't know that podcast, actually. I like the title. Has a great one on the satanic picnic, where American internal family problems were avoided by creating Satan and Satanists as a scapegoat. Oh, very good. I'll have to listen to that. That would be very interesting. Yeah, because I know in America in the 1950s, there was also like concerns about kind of witches who would be put like glass into the candy of kids during what do you call that time when kids go around Halloween? So there are all these weird scares, and yeah, that's interesting. Like all these weird scares where the generalized antagonism of society gets focused in on something, and witches and Satanists were one of those. And by the way, everyone gets caught up in it. That's the funny thing. Smart people get caught up in it as well. Anxiety is a very powerful thing. Okay, Sarah says, question, would love to hear you talk communities. Do you have a taxonomy of the types of liturgies and approaches you have? I know you've written in different places, but a single talk would be cool. All right, I will avoid saying anything about that because I think you're right that it would be great to address that. As you say, I've put them into books. In fact, all of my books, to some extent, kind of touch on that, but I haven't dedicated much directly to that question. So yes, I'll do that. Hold me to that. Let's see. Oh yeah, Sarah says, wish you could get into the Antifa and BLM more. This is a lot of terms. Yeah, there's a lot of terms. By the way, I've written this out, so I'll probably make it available to you. So, because most of what I said is in the paper. I mean, I mostly did it off the top of my head, but it's in the paper. But yeah, it is interesting to me that maybe people have analysed it, but I haven't seen many people analyse it. That Antifa and BLM there is an antagonism there that is mostly not seen because they are so unified around this killing of George Floyd, right? And that the power of that image has brought together actually a number of groups. So there's BLM and Antifa, and then there's kind of like the apostles to these groups. So the apostles to BLM so far, and I think BLM might start to distance themselves from them, but are the corporate America and the media and entertainment industry, and also liberal Democrats. So they're the kind of the apostles to BLM. The apostles to Antifa, fewer, but they would be probably their kind of radical Democratic Party left. But I think at the moment that antagonism is not being explicitly seen. My prediction is it's going to erupt at some point. Let's see. Kate says, if the current system is a giant game of symptom whack-a-mole without being able to address the underlying symptom, how do you engage actively with political causes without becoming cynical or fatigued? Cynicism and fatigue is part of the danger, I suppose, anytime you enter into politics, because to be honest, we're talking about massive systemic changes taking place over time. I do worry at the moment, like so many people have a genuine anxiety and then they're being told a whole pile of things. It's incredibly hard to filter through information. It feels like we can be like a ship tossed in the sea depending on what news sources we engage in and what areas, and it can seem overwhelming. And then sometimes it can feel like whatever you do, you're not doing what's right. That's why I wanted to do this talk. I wanted to bring it right down. I wanted to do a non-anxious kind of like just let's slow it all down and let's start with a basic distinction, dialectic, symptomatic, and let's build up. And I'm going to try and do that over the course of the next few months. I think burnout is huge. This is why I mentioned the two specific things. Maybe that's why. It's like, for me, icon and boundary, my two concrete examples, are good ways of examples of two things that didn't cause cynicism, burnout, frustration, right? Icon, it ran for 11 years. It gave energy to me and the other people doing it. And it felt like it was actually doing something important within Northern Ireland, bringing Protestants and Catholics together indirectly. But also it was doing something, it was creating an insurrection. And by insurrection, I mean that a revolution kind of like moves towards a type of society that doesn't currently exist. You can think of an insurrection as a place that lives out the future in the now. It's where the kingdom is not yet and now. So doing icon felt like in a small way we were living out the type of reality that we wanted to see happen. So then it was a place where, as I gave us energy. And then boundary, I just love that example because every time I go back to Belfast, I hang out there, and it's a community that is dynamic, that is rich, that has done really good work within East Belfast, which was poverty stricken, a lot of unemployment, a lot of violence in East Belfast, but East Belfast is becoming a more vibrant place, and boundary is part of that. So yeah, those are my kind of, I suppose, reasons why I gave those two examples of how do we, give ourselves over to something, as you say, that avoids us just getting bewildered, frustrated, fatigued, and cynical. Oh yes, Joseph says yes. How does a worker get his value of producing the commodity, if that is a central contradiction or symptom, if I'm understanding properly? Yeah, so here's how I think it looks. And there's a few different ways people kind of theorize this, but a way that I think it could look is not going before capitalism, by the way. So this is not about kind of like some sort of nostalgic view of like a primitive society before capitalism. There's all these problems with that. In fact, that's what a lot of kind of fascism falls into, and a lot of aristocratic kind of things are looking back in the past. What's interesting, what Marx is doing in his economic and philosophic manuscripts, which are just notes that he was making before he wrote his major works, but are fascinating. I was reading a little bit of them before giving this talk, actually. What he's doing is he's outlining this notion of alienation. So what does it look like? Yes, so it's not going back necessarily. It's how do we realize that capitalism creates surplus value. As soon as I work on a product, I can make it more valuable. Even if I pick up a shell off the beach and I dust it down and I sell it on Etsy as a ashtray, right? There's labor in that. I picked that shell off the beach, I cleaned it, and I put it onto Etsy. So that's all labor, and then I get money for that. So how does the worker get the value? So in something like boundary, I don't know if this is exactly how it is, but this is how cooperatives work, I think, is the boundary eventually makes surplus value, right? So there's the wage, everyone gets their wage, everyone's paid. Some people are paid more, others less, right? Depending on the amount of time you're there, skills, etc., right? So everyone's paid, the equipment is paid, the rent's paid, all of that. Eventually, after 5 years, they start to make a profit, and that's the surplus value. And then that gets distributed between all the people who did the work. Now, how does it get distributed? I would say that is something that needs to be democratically decided. So just like in politics, every 4 years you vote for someone. So people don't vote on everything. You don't vote on every decision. You vote on someone who will make those decisions on your behalf. And if you don't like them, they can vote them out, right? So in a similar way, I could imagine every 4 years coming together and the people in the company voting on how to distribute the surplus value, right? So maybe people who have been there for longer get more, whatever. Or they vote for the person who's going to make those decisions, sorry. They vote for someone to represent them and to negotiate those kinds of issues. So surplus value is created, but it's given back to the people who are creating it. And by the way, the other part, because I think this is key, the key problem is not wages. The key problem is not paying people properly. I mean, we can think it is. Like if you get paid really well and you go like, oh, wow, I can afford a private yacht or whatever. But still, if you're doing something you hate, right? You're an accountant and you're very good at it and you make a lot of money, but you hate being an accountant, right? You're still wasting 10 hours of your day, 5 days a week, doing something that is alienating to you, that's actually soul destroying. It's destroying your spirit, even if you're getting well compensated for it. So if you have a cooperative, I think you're more inclined to want to create something that you give your life to, that you believe in, right? Something that you're really genuinely passionate about creating, because you're not just making it for the money. You have to do something that on a day-to-day basis you get energy from when you enter in. So I think it provides the opportunity for businesses that are just more personally fulfilling and less alienating. And one other thing on that, supposedly, you want to double check this, but I've heard that cooperatives and privately sourced businesses are just as successful. Cooperatives are not less successful than businesses that have shareholders and get set up in that way. They both, it's very difficult for either of them to survive, but cooperatives do just as well. So yeah, it's an interesting thing. They just can't get as much startup capital. All right. Kate says, I'm not a very good philosopher, I need to read work and theory. Kate, you are like a phenomenon. You're amazing. You're reading everything and bringing all of this in, and you're a doctor, and you're a very good philosopher. So, yeah. Let's see. Oh yeah, I think that's it. Thank you so much for being part of that. I think I want to kind of build on this a little bit in some future talks, so hopefully you'll join me then. Take care. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.